I don't sleep on my side of the bed anymore. It's not because the mattress is different. It's not because the room changed. It's because something about the air feels unfamiliar now, like the walls overheard something I didn't. There was a time when this house felt steady. Predictable. Ordinary in the best way. We had routines that didn't need discussing. Coffee in the same mugs. Evenings that blended together in that quiet, comfortable way married life is supposed to. I used to think that kind of sameness meant safety. Now the sameness feels staged. I still wake up early. I still walk into the kitchen half asleep. But there's this hollow pause before I turn on the light, like I'm bracing for something that isn't there anymore. The ordinary things didn't disappear. They just stopped belonging to me. I used to believe I knew the person sitting across from me at the table. I thought I understood the tone of her voice, the meaning behind her silences. I thought love meant you could relax your guard because the other person was guarding you too. I don't think that anymore. What changed wasn't loud. There was no dramatic confession. No slammed doors. No scene that would make sense if I tried to explain it cleanly. It was quieter than that. It started with a feeling I couldn't defend. She would sit beside me on the couch, close enough that our shoulders touched, but it felt like she was somewhere else. Not distracted in a normal way. Not tired. Just gone. Her eyes would linger on nothing. Her responses came a second too late, like she was pulling them from a different room. If I asked what was wrong, she'd smile softly. Nothing. I'm just thinking. And I'd nod. Because that's what you do. You don't interrogate someone you trust. But the pause after she said it started stretching longer each time. I remember one evening in particular. Nothing important was happening. No argument. No tension. Just the two of us sitting in silence. And I felt it, this shift. Like the ground under something solid had quietly hollowed out. I told myself I was imagining it. That became my reflex. Every time my chest tightened, I blamed stress. Every time I felt that subtle distance, I blamed routine. People change, I thought. Relationships settle. Not everything feels electric forever. I started correcting myself before I could even finish a suspicious thought. Love means giving the benefit of the doubt. Love means not assuming the worst. Love means trusting even when you don't fully understand. I repeated that to myself so often it became a script. The first real crack wasn't dramatic either. It was small. Embarrassingly small. A detail that didn't fit. Something she said earlier in the week didn't line up with something she said later. It wasn't a contradiction big enough to call out. Just a mismatch. A subtle misalignment that left a faint ringing in my ears. When I mentioned it lightly, she looked at me differently. Not angry. Not defensive. Concerned. You've been overthinking a lot lately, she said gently. And suddenly I felt exposed. Like I'd crossed a line I didn't know existed. That was the moment. Not the discovery. Not the proof. The moment I realized that noticing something felt wrong, might itself be wrong. After that, every instinct came with doubt attached. Every question felt dangerous. I started watching myself more than I watched her. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning. Not of an argument. Not of a fight. Of me slowly stepping out of my own certainty. And once you start second-guessing your own reality, it's hard to remember what solid ground ever felt like. If you're drawn to stories about trust unraveling in ways no one sees coming, make sure you subscribe to the channel. These aren't dramatic scandals. They're the quiet kinds, the ones that change you before you even realize something's been taken. Because the worst part wasn't what I eventually found. It was the moment I stopped trusting myself. When I look back at the beginning, it's almost uncomfortable how certain I was. Not dramatic certainty. Not the kind you announce to people. Just a steady belief that I had chosen well. That I was safe. We didn't start with fireworks. We started with comfort. Long conversations that didn't feel forced. Shared jokes that built over time. Small habits forming without either of us planning them. She had a way of making things feel settled. Even when life was busy, even when we were stretched thin, being with her felt like stepping into a room where the temperature was just right. I liked that about us. I liked that we weren't chaotic. We weren't the couple constantly breaking up and getting back together. We didn't test each other's loyalty. At least, I didn't think we did. Trust came easily to me. Maybe too easily. If she said she'd be somewhere, I believed her. If she was late, I assumed traffic. If she seemed distracted, I assumed stress. I didn't scan for threats. I didn't look for inconsistencies. I thought that was what healthy meant, not keeping score. We built routines the way people build furniture. Slowly. Intentionally. Weekend breakfasts. Grocery runs that turned into small debates about brands. Even the way we argued felt contained, like we both wanted to resolve things instead of win. I told myself that was maturity. She would sometimes joke that I was the steady one. The dependable one. I wore that like a badge. I paid attention. I remembered details. I showed up. If she was overwhelmed, I'd take things off her plate without making it a big deal. If she was quiet, I'd give her space. I believed love was something you proved through consistency. And she seemed to appreciate that. At least, that's what I thought. There were moments, small ones, where I noticed she liked being taken care of in a way that went beyond partnership. She'd lean into my reassurance. Let me carry the emotional weight of certain things. At the time, it felt natural. Protective. I didn't see imbalance. I saw responsibility. Looking back, I can admit that I invested deeply. Maybe more than she did. I built my sense of stability around us. Around the idea that we were solid. I remember once telling a friend, we don't have drama. We talk things through. I meant it. When she had a hard week, I'd plan something small. Nothing elaborate. Just thoughtful. A favorite meal. A quiet night with no phones. I believed effort prevented distance. If something felt slightly off, I worked harder. That was my instinct. Improve. Adjust. Show up more. She would sometimes say, "You worry too much about us. We're fine." And I'd laugh it off. But I did worry. Not about betrayal. Not about anything specific. Just about maintaining what we had. I thought relationships faded when people got lazy. I was determined not to let that happen. So I paid attention. I listened carefully when she spoke. I tried to anticipate needs. I avoided unnecessary conflict. If she needed space, I gave it. If she needed reassurance, I offered it freely. There's a kind of pride in being the reliable one. You feel strong. Grounded. Essential. I didn't realize that being essential can slowly turn into being responsible for holding everything together. At the time, though, I felt lucky. We had inside references no one else understood. We could sit in silence without it feeling awkward. I thought that meant intimacy had deepened, not thinned. If someone had asked me then whether I trusted her, I wouldn't have hesitated. Completely. That word would have come out without effort. Trust wasn't something I calculated. It was just there, like the floor beneath you. You don't check it every morning. You don't question whether it will hold. You assume it will. And I did. I assumed that whatever shifts or quiet moods passed between us were temporary. I assumed that love, once built carefully, couldn't quietly rot from the inside. It never occurred to me that the very stability I was so proud of might have been resting on something I wasn't looking at closely enough. Because when you believe you're building a home together, you don't stop to wonder who might be quietly opening a different door. The change didn't arrive all at once. If it had, I might have reacted differently. I might have asked sharper questions. I might have trusted the unease sooner. Instead, it felt like watching color slowly drain from something you look at every day. You don't notice it fading until one day it just seems dull. She started being harder to reach. Not physically. She was still there. Still sitting across from me at dinner. Still next to me in bed. But conversations began to skim the surface. When I asked about her day, I got summaries instead of stories. It was fine. Nothing new. I'm just tired. At first, that didn't seem unusual. Everyone gets tired. Everyone has off days. But the off days stacked. She'd scroll longer than usual. Smile at her phone in a way that didn't invite me in. If I asked what was funny, she'd tilt the screen away slightly and say, just something random. The movement was small. Subtle enough that I could pretend I imagined it. So I did. There were nights when she'd sit beside me on the couch, body angled toward me but attention somewhere else. I'd be talking, and halfway through a sentence I'd realize she hadn't actually heard me. Sorry, what? She'd say, blinking back into the room. I started repeating myself more. I told myself this was adulthood. That comfort naturally turns into quiet. That the intense focus couples have in the beginning eventually softens. But something about it felt different from comfort. Comfort feels warm. This felt distant. She began needing more alone time. That was the phrase she used. It sounded healthy. Independent. I didn't want to be the kind of partner who resented that. So when she closed herself off in another room, I told myself it was normal. When she went out without much explanation beyond, I just need to clear my head, I nodded and said, of course. If a flicker of doubt crossed my mind, I shut it down quickly. You don't police someone you love. You don't demand proof of loyalty when nothing concrete has happened. That would make me insecure. Controlling. And I wasn't that. Still, there were moments that lingered longer than they should have. Once, I reached for her hand while we were walking, and she hesitated before taking mine. It lasted maybe half a second. But I felt it. Another time, I leaned in to kiss her, and she turned her head slightly so it landed on her cheek instead of her lips. She smiled afterward, like it meant nothing. I smiled too. But later that night, lying awake, I replayed it. The hesitations weren't dramatic. They were almost invisible. But they accumulated. I started measuring things I'd never measured before. How often she initiated conversation. How often she laughed at something I said. How quickly she responded when I texted. And then I'd catch myself doing that and feel embarrassed. This is what insecure people do, I thought. So I tried to correct course. I planned small dates again. I made an effort to be lighter, less serious. If she seemed distracted, I didn't press. I gave her room. I convinced myself that pressure would only push her further away. What I didn't say out loud was that I already felt her drifting. It was like sitting next to someone on a train and realizing, slowly, that they were on a different track altogether. Not far enough to point at. Just far enough to feel. And every time I thought about asking directly, something inside me whispered that doing so might prove I was the problem. So I stayed quiet. And the silence between us started to feel heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Eventually, the quiet started feeling louder than anything we could have argued about. I remember sitting across from her one evening, both of us pretending to watch something neither of us was actually paying attention to. The space between us on the couch felt wider than it should have. I didn't plan to say anything that night. But the words came out anyway. I feel like we're not here anymore, I said. I kept my voice calm. Careful. Like something's off. She didn't react the way I expected. There was no anger. No defensiveness. She looked tired. I don't know why you keep saying that, she replied quietly. I'm right here. It wasn't dismissive. It was almost sad. And that made me second-guess myself immediately. I'm not accusing you, I added quickly. I just feel distance. She sighed. Not in frustration. In what felt like disappointment. You don't trust me, she said. That word landed heavier than I expected. I do, I said instinctively. I don't want us to drift. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that, at the time, felt like relief. Maybe we should talk to someone. The suggestion sounded mature. Responsible. Like someone who cared enough to fix things instead of ignoring them. I felt something in my chest loosen. Yeah, I said. If that's what it takes. She nodded slowly. I want us to be better. That sentence stayed with me. I repeated it to myself over the next few days. I want us to be better. It sounded like commitment. When we scheduled the first session, I felt nervous but hopeful. I told myself this was what strong couples did. They didn't wait until things collapsed. They got help. On the way there the first time, she reached for my hand. I remember that detail because it surprised me. It felt like reassurance. We'll figure this out, she said. I believed her. Sitting in that office, I tried to be honest without sounding accusatory. I talked about feeling disconnected. About wanting to understand what had shifted. I made sure to emphasize that I wasn't blaming her. I didn't want to seem paranoid. The therapist nodded thoughtfully. Asked neutral questions. Encouraged openness. When it was her turn to speak, she described feeling overwhelmed. Pressured by my constant worrying. She said she felt like she was always being evaluated, like she couldn't relax without me analyzing her mood. I feel like I'm disappointing him all the time, she said softly. I remember turning toward her in surprise. That's not what I started, but stopped myself. Maybe that's how it felt to her. Maybe my attempts to fix things had come across as criticism. The therapist looked at me gently. Do you think you might be projecting some of your own anxiety onto the relationship? Anxiety. The word stung, even though it was delivered kindly. I just care, I said. I don't want us to lose what we have. And she feels that, the therapist replied. But sometimes too much focus on what might be wrong can create the very distance you're afraid of. I nodded slowly. That made sense. In a way, it felt logical. On the drive home, she was quiet. Not cold. Just reflective. I don't want to feel like I'm being monitored, she said finally. You're not, I answered quickly. I'll stop overthinking. I promise. She gave a small smile. I know you mean well. That night, I felt strangely hopeful. We had named the problem. We had a plan. There was a professional guiding us. I told myself this was proof she cared enough to fight for us. It never crossed my mind that the process of fixing things might be shaping a story where I was the one who needed correcting. At the time, I thought therapy meant we still had something worth saving. I didn't consider that it might mean something else entirely. After the first few sessions, I started preparing before we went. Not notes exactly. Just reminders in my head. Stay calm. Don't sound accusatory. Don't interrupt. Be accountable. I wanted to show that I was willing to change. Each week, she seemed composed. Measured. She spoke clearly about feeling watched in the relationship. About how my questions made her feel like she was under a microscope. "He's always scanning for something," she said once. "Even when nothing's wrong." The therapist nodded slowly. I felt my face warm. "I'm not scanning," I said carefully. "I just notice shifts." "And what do you do when you notice them?" the therapist asked. "I ask about them." "And how does that feel for you?" she asked my wife. "Like I can't just exist," she replied quietly. "Like I'm failing some invisible test." That word again. Failing. I didn't recognize the version of myself she was describing, but I didn't want to dismiss her feelings either. So I leaned inward instead of pushing back. "If I've made you feel that way, I'm sorry," I said. She gave a small nod, eyes glossy but steady. In those rooms, she seemed fragile in a way I didn't see at home. Softer. Hurt. The therapist responded to that softness. I began noticing the subtle shifts in posture. The way the therapist would turn slightly toward her when she spoke about feeling pressured. The way questions directed at me often carried the assumption that my concern was excessive. "Do you think you might struggle with control?" the therapist asked me during one session. The word control made my stomach tighten. "I don't think so," I said. "I just want to feel close." "Sometimes the need for closeness can come across as surveillance," she replied gently. Surveillance. That word stuck. After that session, I replayed every time I'd asked where she'd been. Every time I'd asked why she seemed distant. Had it sounded like interrogation? I started editing myself more aggressively outside the office. If she came home late, I didn't ask follow-up questions. If she was quiet, I let the silence sit. If I felt that familiar knot in my chest, I swallowed it. In the sessions, she continued describing feeling suffocated by my hyper-awareness. "I just want to breathe," she said once. "Without feeling like I'm disappointing him." The therapist turned to me. "Can you give her that space?" "Yes," I said immediately. And I meant it. What I didn't say was that I already had been giving space. That the more room I allowed, the further she seemed to drift. But every time I tried to explain that, it came out wrong. Defensive. Like I was trying to prove something. So I stopped explaining. Instead, I started apologizing. "I can work on that. I didn't realize I was doing that. I don't want to make you feel pressured." Those sentences became familiar. After a while, the sessions felt less like problem-solving and more like performance reviews. She would describe feeling misunderstood. I would nod and accept responsibility for the misunderstanding. The therapist would encourage me to be less reactive, less anxious, more trusting. Trusting. The irony didn't hit me then. At home, she seemed lighter after sessions. Relieved. Almost reassured. "You see," she'd say softly. "We're making progress." I wanted to believe that. But something in me began shrinking. It's hard to explain. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a breaking point. It was the gradual sensation of doubting your own memory. I would remember a conversation one way. She would recall it differently. The therapist would validate her version as the more emotionally grounded one. And I would start wondering if I had exaggerated things. If I had misread tone. If I had built tension where none existed. Once, after I mentioned feeling disconnected again, the therapist asked, "Is it possible that your fear of abandonment is creating distance that isn't actually there?" I froze. Fear of abandonment. I had never used that phrase about myself. But suddenly it seemed plausible. Logical even. Maybe I was the one creating fractures by searching for them. Maybe my need for reassurance was suffocating her. By the time we were several sessions in, I found myself rehearsing what not to say more than what I needed to say. And the strangest part was that she no longer seemed distant in those rooms. Only I did. Somewhere along the way, I stopped bringing things up. Not because the unease disappeared. Because I didn't trust it anymore. Every time I felt that tightening in my chest, I ran it through a filter first. Is this real? Or is this me overreacting again? Is this concern, or is this control? Most of the time, I decided it was me. That was easier. If she came home later than I expected, I didn't ask where she'd been. I'd just say, long day, and leave it at that. If she seemed distracted during dinner, I told myself not everything requires commentary. If she canceled plans last minute, I said, no problem, even when something inside me felt quietly brushed aside. I started measuring my success by how little I reacted. In therapy, the word space came up often. She needed more of it. I needed to give it without attaching questions. So I did. I stopped checking in when she retreated into another room. I stopped asking who she was texting. I stopped mentioning the way she smiled at her phone sometimes, a private smile that didn't include me. I told myself that trust meant not needing reassurance. The strange part was that the more silent I became, the more praised I felt in those sessions. I can see the effort, the therapist said once. You seem less tense. Less tense. I didn't feel less tense. I felt muted. At home, I monitored my tone carefully. If I sounded even slightly disappointed, I corrected it mid-sentence. If she looked irritated, I apologized preemptively. I didn't mean it that way. It's fine. You're right. Those phrases became automatic. There were nights I lay awake replaying conversations, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. Sometimes I would almost reach for her in the dark, wanting to ask if we were okay. But I stopped myself. Don't be needy. Don't make it about you. If she sensed I was unsettled, she'd tilt her head slightly and say, "You're doing it again." Doing what? Looking for something. I'd force a smile. Sorry. The word sorry started feeling like part of my identity. I convinced myself this was growth. That love sometimes meant swallowing pride. That compromise meant discomfort. I didn't notice how much of myself I was shrinking. The things I used to say easily, observations, concerns, even jokes about feeling disconnected, stayed locked in my throat. I didn't want to reinforce the image of the anxious husband who couldn't relax. So I relaxed. At least outwardly. Inside, I felt like I was standing very still in a room that was slowly rearranging itself. She seemed calmer during this phase. More settled. Less defensive. Sometimes even affectionate in brief flashes that felt almost strategic. See, she said once, resting her head on my shoulder. When you're not overthinking, we're good. I nodded. We're good. I repeated that to myself. But the quiet didn't feel like peace. It felt like I had agreed not to notice things anymore. And when you stop trusting your own reactions long enough, you start losing the ability to tell the difference between patience and surrender. It happened on a day that wasn't supposed to matter. There was no argument that morning. No tension hanging in the air. She had left earlier than usual, saying she needed time to herself. Something about clearing her head. I nodded, like I always did. I ended up coming home earlier than I planned. A meeting had been cancelled. The house was quiet when I walked in. Still. Undisturbed. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. I went into the bedroom to grab something from the dresser. Her bag was on the chair, slightly open. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't suspicious in that moment. I just noticed a folded piece of paper near the top, sticking out enough to catch my eye. It could have been anything. A grocery receipt. A reminder. Trash. I picked it up without thinking. 2 tickets. That was the first thing I registered. 2 seats. Same time. Same evening. An evening she had told me she'd spent alone. I stood there longer than I should have, just staring at the print. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explicit. There was no name attached to it. No message written in the margins. Just proof that she hadn't been where she said she was. I felt something drop in my stomach. I tried to explain it away immediately. Maybe she bought two by mistake. Maybe she met a friend and didn't mention it because she didn't want another overthinking conversation. Maybe. I read the date again. It lined up exactly with a night she had described in detail. She'd said she needed space. Said she was working through her thoughts alone. Said it had been productive. I remembered that word clearly. Productive. My hand started to shake, but not in a dramatic way. It was more like a low hum under my skin. The strangest part wasn't the tickets. It was what they represented. For weeks, maybe months, I had been sitting in therapy sessions apologizing for not trusting enough. Promising to be less suspicious. Working to give her room to breathe. And here, in my hand, was evidence that something about the story I had been fed wasn't accurate. Not a full confession. Not a smoking gun. Just a crack. I sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to steady my breathing. If I brought this up, how would it sound? Accusatory. Paranoid. Exactly the role I'd been trying so hard not to play. I imagined holding up the receipt and saying, "Can you explain this?" And I could already hear the response. "You're digging again. You're looking for something. It's not what you think." The tickets weren't proof of an affair. They weren't proof of anything beyond a lie about location. But that was enough. Because the lie wasn't random. It was timed. Timed to a night when she had framed herself as reflective. Vulnerable. Honest. And suddenly the therapy sessions replayed in my mind differently. All those conversations about my anxiety. My need to control. My imagined distance. What if the distance wasn't imagined? What if I had been reacting to something real, and then apologizing for noticing it? The room felt smaller. I realized that the sickness in my stomach wasn't just about who she might have gone with. It was about the possibility that the entire process of fixing us had been built on a version of events that protected her and corrected me. I folded the receipt carefully and put it back exactly where I'd found it. Not because I was afraid. Because I needed time. Time to figure out whether this was a misunderstanding, or the first solid piece of something I had been told didn't exist. If you've ever found something small that made your whole reality tilt, take a second and subscribe, like, and comment below. Sometimes it's not the dramatic discoveries that change everything, it's the quiet ones. And standing there in that room, I understood one thing clearly for the first time. I hadn't been imagining the distance. I didn't bring it up that night. I waited. Part of me hoped there was a simple explanation. Something reasonable enough that I could feel foolish and relieved at the same time. But the longer I held on to it, the heavier it felt. A couple of days later, when the house was quiet again, I decided to say something. Not dramatically. Not as an accusation. Just a question. I was organizing the bedroom the other day, I said carefully. I saw a receipt in your bag. For 2 tickets. I kept my voice steady. Neutral. She looked up slowly. What about it? The calmness in her tone made me second-guess my approach immediately. I thought you said you were alone that night, I said. I just didn't know you had plans. There was a pause. Not long. Just enough to feel deliberate. Oh. That, she said, like it was insignificant. I ran into someone I knew. It wasn't planned. Someone? I asked. A friend, she replied. It didn't seem important to mention. It didn't seem important. I tried to measure my reaction. Was I being unreasonable? I guess it just caught me off guard, I said. Because you told me you were by yourself. She exhaled slowly, and I recognized that sound. The one that meant I was approaching dangerous territory. This is what I mean, she said. You're dissecting a random detail. I'm not dissecting, I said quickly. You just what? She interrupted, her voice still even. You're doing that thing again. That thing. Looking for inconsistencies, she continued. Turning normal situations into something bigger. I felt the ground start to shift under the conversation. I'm not accusing you of anything, I said. I just wanted clarity. And I gave it to you, she replied. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't think it needed a report. A report. The language made it sound ridiculous. Petty. I hesitated. Who was it? Her expression changed slightly. Not anger. Something closer to disappointment. Why does that matter? Because you told me you were alone. And now you know I wasn't, she said. So what's the issue? The issue. I struggled to articulate it without sounding exactly like the insecure version of myself I'd been working so hard to correct. It just feels like something you would have mentioned before, I said quietly. She shook her head. You see how you can't let anything go? This is why therapy has been focused on your trust issues. There it was. The framework we'd built in those sessions now applied directly to this moment. I felt myself shrinking again. I'm not trying to start something, I said. I just felt weird seeing it. You felt weird, she repeated. That doesn't mean something's wrong. Silence filled the space between us. I wanted to push further. To say that it wasn't just about the tickets. That it was about a pattern. About a feeling that never quite left. But I could already hear how it would sound. Paranoid. Anxious. Projecting. You're exhausting yourself, she added more softly. And honestly, sometimes it's exhausting for me too. That landed harder than anything else she'd said. Exhausting. I nodded slowly. Okay. Okay. The conversation ended there. No raised voices. No dramatic fallout. Just me standing in the kitchen afterward, realizing that I had presented the one solid inconsistency I'd found, and somehow walked away feeling like I owed her an apology. And for the first time, I started to wonder if the issue wasn't whether she was hiding something, but whether I had already been positioned to lose, no matter what I uncovered. After that conversation, something changed in me. Not because I suddenly knew the truth. Because I realized I might never get it from her. The house went back to its routine, but it felt thinner, like everything was being held together by habit instead of connection. We still ate dinner. Still exchanged small talk. Still moved around each other like people who knew the choreography. But I couldn't stop hearing her words. You're doing that thing again. Your trust issues. Exhausting. It was like the relationship had become a room where every question echoed back as proof that I was unstable. So I stopped asking. For a while, that silence looked like peace. She seemed calmer. Less guarded. Almost satisfied. And I felt myself disappearing. I started spending more time alone without realizing it. Taking longer walks. Sitting in my car before coming inside. Not because I wanted to avoid her, exactly, but because the air between us felt so loaded. Therapy became pointless. We still went for a few more sessions, but I barely spoke. She would describe feeling hopeful about our progress, about how much lighter things were now that I wasn't constantly suspicious. The therapist would smile and nod. And I would sit there, listening to my own life being rewritten in real time. At home, she would occasionally reach for me, a hand on my shoulder, a brief kiss on the cheek. See, she'd say softly. We're okay. But I didn't feel okay. I felt like I was living beside someone who had learned exactly how to keep me quiet. The breaking point wasn't a fight. It was exhaustion. One night, we were sitting at the table after dinner, the dishes still out. The room was dim, quiet. She was scrolling on her phone, expression unreadable. I looked at her and realized I didn't know how to reach her anymore. Not without being accused of overthinking. Not without becoming the problem again. "I don't think this is working," I said, surprising myself with how calm it sounded. She looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" I hesitated. "I feel like I'm losing myself trying to prove I trust you." Her face tightened. "So you're blaming me now?" "No," I said quickly. "I'm saying I can't keep doing this." She leaned back in her chair, arms crossing. "Doing what?" "Being married?" The word hit like a trap. "I don't know what's real anymore," I admitted quietly. "I don't know if I'm imagining things or if I'm being made to feel like I am." Her eyes flashed with something sharp. "That's a really unfair thing to say." Maybe it was. But it was also the first honest thing I'd said in months. The silence stretched between us. Then she stood, gathering her plate with a kind of controlled finality. "If you can't move past your issues," she said, "I don't know what you expect me to do." And that was it. No admission. No reassurance. No reaching. Just a door closing, emotionally, right in front of me. In the days that followed, we moved like strangers sharing space. Conversations became logistical. Nights became separate even when we were in the same bed. The relationship didn't explode. It collapsed inward. And I realized that whatever we had been trying to save might have already been gone long before I ever found that receipt. The only question left was what, exactly, had replaced it. The truth didn't arrive in a dramatic confession. There was no moment where she sat me down and admitted to everything. It came in pieces. Indirect. Almost accidental. After we separated, the silence between us became official. Fewer messages. Shorter exchanges. The kind of communication you use when you're dividing a life instead of living it. I stopped going to therapy. There didn't seem to be a point anymore. For a while, I questioned myself constantly. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I had let one inconsistency unravel something that could have been repaired. Then a mutual acquaintance mentioned something casually in conversation. "I didn't realize you were having such a hard time back then," they said. She seemed really close with someone from one of those group sessions. I felt my chest tighten. "Group sessions?" I asked. "Yeah. The workshops she started attending. I thought that was part of the whole growth phase you two were in." Growth phase. That was the phrase she had used. I didn't push for details. I didn't need to. Later, scrolling through old messages and dates, I began connecting timelines I hadn't wanted to see clearly before. The nights she'd needed space. The increased privacy. The emotional distance that had felt so sharp but so impossible to prove. There was no clear confirmation of an affair. No message that spelled it out. But there was enough to understand that she had built something parallel to our marriage. A separate emotional world I wasn't invited into. And more than that, she had framed my discomfort with that distance as instability. The validation wasn't satisfying. It didn't feel like winning an argument. It felt hollow. Because by the time I understood that my instincts hadn't been imagined, the damage was already done. I had spent months apologizing for noticing real shifts. Months shrinking myself to avoid being labeled controlling or anxious. Months trying to fix something that may not have been broken in the way I thought, but was certainly not honest. What hurt most wasn't the possibility that she'd connected with someone else. It was realizing that the therapy, the place I thought we were rebuilding, had been a shield. A way to define me as the problem before I could define the pattern. Even now, I can't say with certainty what that relationship was. Emotional. Physical. Temporary. Ongoing. I only know that it existed in the spaces where I had been told nothing was wrong. And that the moment I stopped trusting myself was the moment I became easiest to manage. By the time clarity came, I wasn't fighting for the marriage anymore. I was trying to recover the version of myself who once believed his own perceptions without needing permission. I think about it sometimes in the quiet moments. Not the tickets. Not the sessions. Not even the arguments that never fully happened. I think about how easily trust can be reshaped. How betrayal doesn't always look like someone running off into the night. Sometimes it looks like someone sitting beside you, calm and composed, while slowly teaching you to doubt your own instincts. I used to believe betrayal was an event. Now I think it can be a process. A slow rewriting. A person doesn't just hide something. They hide it in a way that makes you feel wrong for noticing the absence. And that's what stays with me. The way I became smaller. The way I learned to apologize for questions that deserved answers. The way, working on us, became a language that protected her and corrected me. Maybe she never thought of it as cruelty. Maybe she told herself she was doing what she had to do. Maybe she believed her own version of events. That's the part one still can't fully untangle. Because life rarely gives you clean villains. It gives you people who justify. People who avoid. People who choose comfort over honesty. And it gives you the aftermath of trying to figure out what was real. I don't tell this story because I have perfect clarity. I tell it because I know what it feels like to lose trust twice, once in someone else, and once in yourself. And I keep coming back to one question, the one I wish I'd asked sooner. If someone convinces you that your suspicion is the problem, while they quietly protect the thing you're sensing, is that betrayal? Or is it something worse? If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more real, emotionally grounded stories about love, trust, and the moments that change everything. Like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and leave a comment below, because sometimes the hardest part isn't what happened. It's what you were made to doubt.